This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Links to learn more about our guest today can be found in the show notes. You can support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon.com. By joining on Patreon, you help keep Beyond the Big Screen sustainable and get many great benefits. Go to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more and sign up. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Welcome back to Beyond the Big Screen. We have another installment of Hollywood Hates History today. So far, this series has been a collaboration with Scott Rank of the History Unplugged podcast, but today I'm joined by Doctors Rad and G from the Partial Historians podcast. Let's see if Hollywood hates history today. Doctors Radford and Greenfield of the Partial Historians podcast love movies. When we talked about having a collaboration episode for my other podcast, The History of the Papacy, they suggested the 1951 drama Quo Vadis. This is a spectacular movie and kicked off a whole genre of movies just over the top epics. Will Hollywood hate or love history today? You'll have to listen to find out. If you have historical movies you love or hate, let me know, and maybe we can make it into an episode for Hollywood Hates History. I have a few other movies in the works with Scott Rank and other podcasters. If you'd like to participate in Hollywood Hates History, send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you again for listening, and I will see you next time beyond the big screen. Today, we are joined together by the hosts of the Partial Historians podcast, Doctors Radford and Greenfield, and I'm Steve Guerra. And we're here to discuss the 1951 film Quo Vadis, starring Robert Taylor, Deborah Kerr, Peter Ustinov as Nero, and many others. This is an epic sword and sandal film that clocks in at nearly 3 hours in length. And we need some serious top-notch scholars to tackle this beast of a movie. So, thank you so much for all of us collaborating together to talk about this great movie. So before we get started, why don't you introduce yourselves?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I'll elbow Dr. G out of the way. So I became interested in looking at history on film. So that's why Quo Vadis piqued my attention, because I tend to focus on the films of the 1950s and early 1960s in particular. And I've always been also very interested in the Julio-Claudian period. So this film ticks a lot of boxes for me.
Hello. I deserve to be trampled by Dr. Radness. Being the film expert that she is, I'm an ancient historian, and I focus on things to do with the late Republic and the early imperial period. And this means that I've done lots of undergraduate coursework teaching on the Julio-Claudians, and Nero is obviously a standout. So always trying to figure out what's going on with the source material. And then you're just kind of waiting for the students to come at you being like, oh, I saw Nero in this film. And you're like, okay, time to deconstruct.
And then I'm Steve, and I host a podcast called The History of the Papacy. I'm not a scholar or expert. I'm just a very interested amateur in early Christianity.
Well, that movie definitely ticks your boxes then as well.
Yeah, definitely.
I think this is going to have a lot of good things to say about Catholicism/Protestantism, potentially.
Why don't we start with the context of the movie? It was the early 1950s, and I read that this is one of the first big Hollywood sword and sandal epics post-World War II. What was kind of going on at that time?
Oh, well, I mean, there's a lot that you can say about the background to this movie. Obviously, it's based on a novel from which was written in the 1890s, and it was actually written in sort of a serialized form by a Polish author called Henry Sienkiewicz. And it's been adapted a number of times to the screen, as well as being turned into stage plays and opera throughout its life. It's always been pretty popular. In fact, the guy who wrote the novel actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for this novel. But I think this particular version of the movie has a lot to say about the post-World War II American world and also the emerging Cold War. I think there's a lot of key scenes, particularly involving Nero, which sort of tap into that. What did you think, Dr. G?
Oh, yeah. There's that amazing triumph scene for Marcus Vinicius. And I mean, the thing that they've done with the crowd sequence is just on a massive scale anyway. They're going for that feeling of spectacle. But then you get the back shots of behind Nero, of him looking out over the crowd. And the Roman salute is a fascist salute. And there's no way that you're not supposed to make the connection to things like Triumph of the Will, for instance. So there's ways in which they're mirroring some really traumatic moments from recent history into the visualization of this film. And things like that crowd scene and also the visual symbolism that you see around his throne. He's surrounded with the fasces, and there's also the eagle. And you think, okay, they're drawing some very clear parallels to Mussolini's Italy as well in this moment. And so you've got Mussolini, you've got Nazi Germany, and then you've got Cold War, and you're like, this is all happening in like this really concise space and visual framework of this film. It's really quite incredible.
Yeah, and Nero's the way that Nero speaks in this film, there are a couple of scenes that are obviously meant to tap into that sort of Nero as Mussolini, Nero as Hitler, Nero as Stalin parallel that the studio was very aware of, and I think sort of cashed in on to a certain extent. So, for example, when Nero is explaining how he's, planning to, spoilers, that he's planning to destroy Rome.
He wants spoilers.
I know that he's planning to destroy Rome and how he's going to, set fire to it. And he's talking about how Petronius won't like his methods. He talks about how he ends up talking about, how as an artist, he must somehow exceed the stature of man in both good and evil, which is obviously meant to be tapping into a little bit of Nietzsche. And which were in the popular imagination of the time would be very much associated with the Nazis. The way that he talks about what he plans to do with the Christians, he talks about them in terms of wiping them out, that once he's done with them, the world will not be sure that they even existed, that he's going to exterminate them. That sort of language is obviously meant to be tapping into the sort of what's just happened really with the Holocaust and all that kind of stuff as well. So I think that they're laying it on fairly thick when they get to have a go at Nero.
I don't think subtlety is the name of the game.
There was no subtlety.
I was like, I'll jump to you, Steve.
No, what did you think, Steve?
There was not one drop of subtlety in that movie for 3 hours.
No, I love it. I love it because Peter Ustinov is so brilliant.
I thought it was interesting, though, that the movie, it mirrored in many ways, at least the bear narrative of the classic, from the Christian perspective, that Nero burned Rome and blamed it on the Christians, and then Peter being in Rome and Paul in Rome, and then the uncanonical aspect from the Gospel of Peter. It really followed that closely. It didn't diverge at all from that narrative at all.
No. I mean, it is interesting because from the Roman source material, they make it fairly clear that that whilst there were rumors about Nero setting alight to the fire of 64, I mean, particularly Tacitus, it seems to be fairly clear that Nero wasn't in the city and that he actually organized relatively effectively, relief for the people of Rome afterwards, as much as you can in a fire that was supposedly so extensive. But yeah, they really go in this one for Nero is responsible.
I actually enjoy the way that they create this character arc for him, because it's going against a bit of the source material. We know that Nero wasn't in the city, but we have that historical detail retained in the film nevertheless as part of the planning mechanism to bring his artistry to life, and the interweaving of some of the historical details that we can confirm in the material, plus what has become the really popular narrative elements, and perhaps the novel itself is part of the establishment of these ideas as well, this idea of the fiddling while Rome burns. This is all coming together in almost Ustinov's performance, I would say, because I think the script is not great. I would argue.
Hold your tongue.
Oh, look, I feel like, okay, so you've got the whole sort of cavalcade of like studio actors who are performing to type. And then you've got Ustinov who's trying to build a character, and he seems to be the only one who's really striving for that in a way that a modern audience would recognize. So the style that he brings to the execution of that role actually makes the script hold up. Whereas I'm not sure that that's arguably not so true for some of the other characters.
I think that's actually true of, I mean, having Peter Ustinov was also in Spartacus, which I've looked at. So I've actually looked at a lot of his movies. I think that's just actually true of Peter Ustinov in this time. I think he was a much more, he is a more naturalistic sort of modern style of actor, and he does often stand out in these sorts of films as a result of that. For example, he was the only actor on Spartacus to win an Oscar for his role. And I think it's because, again, he brings that ease to the role, whereas everyone else seems a little bit stiff to our sort of modern sensibilities. But I think it's really interesting, and this sort of taps into what we were saying before as well, that Nero in this particular version, in the novel itself and in previous film versions, Nero sets fire to Rome because he wants to see a burning city and be inspired as an artist, you know, like with the burning of Troy, he needs to be able to see it to really feel it. But they also tap into this idea in the 1951 film that Nero wanted to burn Rome because he wanted to reconstruct the city. And you get to see that fantastic model, which is actually showing the Rome in the era of Constantine. But that's the reason why I think they did that again was to echo Mussolini.
Yeah, is it?
Yeah.
I was reading somewhere that there's some debate about where that model came from, because it doesn't appear to be the one that we do have in Rome today. It seems that maybe it was made as a prop. I'm wondering if anybody knows any more details about this. I haven't been able to investigate that further.
You know, I can't remember exactly, but I feel like it is meant to be like the Mussolini type of model, but I don't think it is the actual one, but I could be wrong about that. I can't honestly remember.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors. And I believe the movie was filmed in Cinema City, Cinecittà, I think it's called, and just outside of Rome, which most of the movie just looks like soundstage.
It was filmed at Cinecittà, yeah.
Oh, yeah. A lot of those exterior shots are all Rome. It's quite incredible. Obviously, they've used a lot of the set lots in order to construct the ancient version, but when you see them riding around along the Appian Way and things like that, you've got all of the Mediterranean pines, and that's all part of the broader landscape that Cinecittà was able to access at this time. The studio is just incredibly massive.
Given all the Mussolini overtones, it's interesting to film it at Cinecittà, which is obviously the studio that Mussolini helped to establish.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about Marcus Vinicius, who was played by Robert Taylor. He was especially in the early part of the movie, he was very interesting, especially in his relationship to Lygia, his love interest. I found it very, very creepy.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that had toxic masculinity written all over it.
Yeah, I think I'd say for all womankind, good for you.
I'm glad it felt creepy. Yeah, this is like pickup artistry 101, where it's like, you know, maybe if I, you know, just keep pursuing, she'll eventually relent. And then it's like, then the turnaround moment where he's like, you know what, I never want to see you again. It's just like, marry me.
Yeah, he is an interesting character. I mean, Marcus Vinicius and Lygia, they're obviously fictional characters that help to tie the sort of historical set pieces together and bring the Christian and Roman worlds together, which is, classic novel, toga play, Roman versus Christian movie type of storyline. But yeah, it is really, I find this really interesting though, because having Robert Taylor play this role, Robert Taylor was one of the friendly witnesses to testify in front of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, which had just happened just before Quo Vadis was actually made. So he was a real symbol, perhaps slightly unwillingly, of the Hollywood right at this point in time. And he was a massive, massive star. So I found it very interesting that he was at the forefront of this movie, especially again being made by MGM when L.B. Mayer had also been one of the friendly witnesses to testify in front of HUAC.
So are you saying there's a conflict of interest here, or like in what way is it sort of encouraging your thoughts around him as a character and actor?
Well, I think that Quo Vadis, whilst there are a lot of tones about, the fascists and they are picking up very much on the Mussolini-Hitler parallels, this is also a Cold War movie, as a lot of these movies about the ancient world that are made in the 1950s are. And it is very much tapping into that freedom versus tyranny idea that President Truman had outlined in 1947. And so, as is typical in these sorts of movies, I think that you are meant to have this sort of clash between, the freedom and the oppressors. And I find it very interesting that Robert Taylor is cast as the Roman, but he's the Roman that's going to come over to the Christian side and stand up to Nero. So he is going to, in the end, convert to the side that represents freedom.
Oh, and surely an audience going into this film in 1951 is maybe waiting for that character arc to happen,
for sure,
given that context.
Yeah, well, I say these sorts of movies are based on novels and then toga plays from the 19th century, which have a very tried and true formula, and usually at the center of that is this Christian Roman love story between a man and a woman. So it's a well-trodden path.
All right. Maybe you can speak a little bit to this, Steve, because I'm interested in the way in which Lygia is the representative of the Christians. Are we often seeing in these kinds of stories a masculine figure turning from a sort of secular paganism to a Christian outlook? Is that something that you've noticed?
I found that a bit odd. For one, at that most earliest point, I don't know how many high-ranking Romans would have been swung to Christianity yet, especially since there really wasn't a Christianity as such, not the way they portrayed it, that I'm a Christian. In Rome at that time, a Christian and a Jew would have been almost indistinguishable, especially to someone like Nero. I mean, even by the records of the day from Gospel of Peter's, I think they said there was maybe 5 Christian families who would have been essentially Second Temple Jews. And that would have been it. And there would have been a fairly significant population of Jews in Rome at that time. But for anybody who was outside of the Jewish community, Jewish Christian community, they would have been completely indistinguishable.
Yes, I think you're right about that, in the sense that knowledge about what the difference is between a Jewish person and a Christian person in this time period is probably loosely conceived at best, if it's thought about at all. We know that the Roman connection with Judea becomes fraught in the decade following Nero, and there is conflict going on there already. But the permeation of the thought, we really don't see that in our historical source material until we get into like the 2nd and 3rd century, where you get a lot more of the sort of philosophical dialogues coming through with a really Christian bent and looking at positioning a transition to Christianity as a positive step forward. But for the Roman on the street, I think it's very unlikely in the period of Nero that they would have necessarily had much of a sense of what's going on. And this means that potentially an emperor could dictate what an understanding might be, if we want to go down that sort of darker path of like what is, if any, Christian.
Well, I think this is where it's obviously very much based on the original novel and the subsequent renditions of it. I think the reason why they've chosen to do this is very much based in that reality, not the time of Nero in that sense, because Henry Sienkiewicz was a Polish author. And Lygia and Ursus, the sort of giant guy that protects her in all of the movie, they were meant to be sort of representative of the Polish people and the Catholic Church in Poland at the time, and their resistance to the people that were oppressing them. And obviously, at the time, people were obviously more likely to be Christian, particularly if you're talking about, in Poland with the importance of the Catholic Church in maintaining Polish culture during this awkward time. So I think that characterization is speaking to Sienkiewicz's time, not necessarily Nero's time, but that's just my interpretation of it.
Did they ever in the movie specifically say that Lygia was from Poland or from somewhere in the north? I don't.
Oh, yeah. There is a connection there. So Lygia is called Lygia because she's from Lygia and she's a Lygian, and Lygia is a region that is connected relatively with modern Poland.
The people that she's connected to in this film are a real tribe who are mentioned in ancient sources like Strabo and Tacitus. So he has rooted that in some sort of historical detail, even if Lygia herself is obviously incredibly fictional.
It might be a little early in the conversation to discuss this yet, but being that Quo Vadis was an early or one of the earliest of a genre of movies that would come out throughout the 50s, like Ben-Hur, 10 Commandments, King of Kings. What influence, if any, did Quo Vadis have on these other movies that came out that were like a huge hit in the 50s?
Oh, well, I mean, Quo Vadis was a huge hit. It was actually slightly too early for the widescreen technology that would dominate a lot of the, sort of sword and sandal or toga epics of this particular era, because it was actually in 1953 that The Robe came out, and that was the one that sort of debuted CinemaScope. So it was a bit too early for that, but it was still a really massive hit, and it was heavily promoted by MGM. I mean, it's really interesting that the Romans often on screen, particularly in films like Quo Vadis, are shown to be these really debauched, corrupted, sort of lascivious, indulgent people. And yet, in order to promote the movie, the studios go in for lots of tie-ins. Like you could buy Quo Vadis raincoats, sports shirts, wallpapers, tablecloths, and my favorite is Quo Vadis fire insurance. And they even had like publicity shots of Peter Ustinov selling houses for Crest Manor and all sorts of things. So it's almost, in a way, you could almost see the Rome of these epics as being a metaphor for Hollywood itself. But I think Quo Vadis is also emblematic of the sort of tension in Hollywood at this time, because in 1948, there had been a landmark legal case in which it was basically like an anti-monopoly ruling. So the studios used to have this enormous amount of control over movie products, from making them to distributing them, and they used to actually own the movie cinemas that they would screen their movies in. In 1948, it was ruled that was illegal, and they had to get rid of their cinema chain, so they couldn't just pump their product into their old sort of chains of distribution. So I think they were feeling a little bit nervous. 1950s was also the decade that TV came along in a big way and started to sort of challenge the need to go to the movies for your entertainment. And it was also, in the post-World War II decade, you had the growth of suburbia and the suburban lifestyle. And, do you really want to go to the movie cinemas or all that kind of stuff? There's a lot of things going on that's making the movie business itself nervous, not to mention the whole HUAC thing where you had movie stars being investigated for so-called communist affiliations. So I think they sort of saw the need to make these sorts of big epics with these very heavy, meaty storylines that are going to attract people to the cinemas. And it's also, I think, the very heavy sort of Christian storyline is tapping into the fact that this is really the time in sort of 1950 where going to church and being a Christian really becomes not just something personal, but something you do as a patriotic American to show your allegiance to America and the freedom that America represents, as opposed to the godless communists.
I believe that MGM was actually heavily in debt when they came around to making this film, and they had to put up a lot of money. Like, the budget is huge. So it's kind of like they're also going for the high risk, potentially high reward model of how much can we put into a film in order to get people into the cinema. And this does seem to pay off.
Yeah, which did pay off because it did really well for them financially and received 8 Oscar nominations.
1951 was also around the time right after World War II. The U.S. had gone back into a light depression, not quite back to the Great Depression, but it was right around the early 50s where things were starting to be on the uptick, where people would have a little extra money to go to the movies and, spend money on that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't want to miss the great Christian epic of your time, would you? I mean, this story does a really good balance between a historical storyline and a very sort of clear Christian moral storyline, and that they converge in greater and greater ways towards the climax, with maybe a rushed resolution of sorts, but one that leaves you with Marcus Vinicius and Lygia like in the spot where Peter has seen and had a moment, and you're like, oh, okay, this is tying it all together very nicely. You can see how things are going to progress. And that sort of that moment towards the end where he's talking with his second, where they're talking about a more permanent faith for a more permanent world.
Yeah, definitely. And I think they were also, you can't underestimate how much of a draw Robert Taylor was at this point in time in terms of attracting the crowds, needed to make this movie a big hit. But in their promotion of it, they were actually also emphasizing their generosity and the idea that they were sort of helping out with America's, Marshall Plan to try and put Europe back on a firmer economic footing as well, because they talked about in their campaign book for this movie how they donated a huge amount of the food for the feast scenes, like, at Nero's palace, there's that massive feast scene. They'd given the food that was left over to relief agencies for Italian children who were in need after World War II.
Yeah, I think that Robert Taylor is one where I can see, like, at that time, he was huge. I think maybe part of the reason why Quo Vadis doesn't stick out like maybe the 10 Commandments does is because Robert Taylor died relatively young.
True.
And a lot of the movies he did afterwards aren't like the big movies that carried through to modern times, if you will, into the later times. Looking through his filmography, nothing stuck out as like a huge movie that, and I enjoy to watch some of those movies, a good Charlton Heston movie, and he made a lot more into a much later time.
Yeah, I think Robert Taylor, even at the time, even though he was a massive draw card and women, swooned at the sight of him, even at the time, everyone was sort of aware that he wasn't the best actor. I kind of feel sorry for him because I think people were quite open with the fact that they thought he was hot but dumb. So he was the pretty boy actor that would draw a lot of women in. But yeah, I don't think he certainly wasn't a Peter Ustinov, and he wasn't a Charlton Heston, and he wasn't a Clark Gable. He doesn't have that kind of acting quality that necessarily draws you back, 60 years later.
Since we're talking about it, maybe we'll go through some of the actors. Deborah Kerr is another one who, looking at hers, none of her movies really stuck out either, except for maybe The King and I. I
was going to say, you can't forget The King and I.
But other than that, a lot of those movies, From Here to Eternity, where did she stand at that time?
She's actually one person I didn't look into in as much detail at this time. I have a feeling she was still relative. I don't think she was at the peak of her career at this particular point in time. I think she was sort of heading into the sort of heyday, because she did make a lot of sort of classic films, like, as you say, From Here to Eternity, and also An Affair to Remember was obviously pretty big, and it's had a good afterlife because of Sleepless in Seattle. So yeah, I think she was really heading into it in the sort of the mid 1950s was when she I think hit her real peak.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. And then Leo Gen or Jen? I'm not Gen.
I'm actually not sure. Yeah.
Petronius. He's somebody who I think I've seen him in tons of things, but I would have never been able to put my mind to what his name is. But he did a really great job. He
was great. I mean, I think one of the most interesting roles in whatever version of Quo Vadis you look at, is the role of Petronius.
I think it's a real struggle for a historian seeing Petronius get so much of the limelight because you kind of want Seneca to get the limelight, and he really doesn't because he's partly out of the scene by this stage. But also it seems like, particularly in this version, that a lot of the things that Seneca strived for have just been transferred to Petronius as well. So you're like, wait a minute. I recognize this guy, but what's his name again? You say Petronius? I'm not sure I'm so comfortable with that. And Petronius, I mean, loosely, this is the guy who composes the Satyricon.
So you say, Dr. G. So you say.
I can only speak to what I've read.
I know. He probably did.
Probably. So, I mean, having a character that is very much about the satire, and I do love the beautiful interaction between these two characters and the actors, where it's kind of, you get to watch Ustinov's Nero be persuaded routinely, it would seem, even though he's being insulted at the same time. And and it's only right towards the end of that, with the final letter, where he has the realization that actually this has all been a betrayal, which I think was just a fantastic sort of arc for that relationship to go through as well. But this does lead me to thinking about the sort of the motif of assisted suicide. That is also a key feature that seems to run through this film, where Petronius and Eunice go through this process in protest, and this eventually is then mirrored by Nero himself.
Well, I suppose there is some historical basis in that Petronius, the historical Petronius, as far as we can tell from the limited amount we know about him, was essentially kind of forced into committing suicide. And Nero did have to also commit suicide and apparently couldn't do it without some help.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about the relationship between Eunice and Petronius. That was another one that seemed, it was a very odd chemistry between the two of them.
Bizarre. Yeah. I mean, it is very much, again, it's very much based on the novel. I mean, even to the point where in the novel, Eunice does actually make out with a statue of Petronius while she's, thinking about her hidden love for her master.
Oh my goodness.
But I mean, it's just sort of, I mean, the gender politics in this film definitely don't stand up to modern day scrutiny.
I think this is to give you a really viable candidate for contrast with Poppaea.
Yes, yeah.
And both Lygia and Eunice are doing this in different ways. One is showing you how it could be done through a secular Roman vision. One is showing you how it could be done through a Christian, and both stand as a sort of a light mirror to Poppaea's darkness, and I love the way the actress who plays Poppaea portrays her as well.
I know, it's so obvious.
Just like so precise, the arching of the brow and the smile drawing people closer. They're like, that's the kind of bad woman I want to be.
Yeah, but I mean, it's very much playing into this. I mean, we always see this sort of idea that the good women are the women that stay out of politics. Poppaea is the bad woman because she's involved with politics. She's going for public power, not just, a private role. And it's also in a way, these sorts of movies could also be speaking to the gender politics of America in the 1950s, in that you do have obviously all these men coming back from World War II and in this sort of hyper militaristic, hyper masculine culture. And you kind of see this process where Robert Taylor, Marcus Phoenicius, he starts out that way, but then gradually he's sort of domesticated by Liggio and going back to what could be seen to be sort of the true way of America, which is, something that is rooted around the family unit and the domestic influence of the feminine characters and the religious beliefs, which is what we sort of see happen obviously by the end of this particular movie, because the Romans always have the most screwed up personal lives in these movies. It's a sign of their decadence and corruption, whereas the Christians have the more traditional family values.
And you do certainly see a very clear sense in which women are positioned solely in relation to their to their position in regards to men.
Yes.
So, and this is happening to all of them. And so these vision of women as written by men, it's not at all clear to me that it feels like a story I can get into in that sense. It's like watching the progression of Lygia's character, where you have to be told that she's always been looking at him in a certain way, and you've never noticed that she cared. I was like, she's trying to get away from this guy. Marcus Vinicius keeps following her around in her own garden, and she's sort of like, I've got to keep lighting these fires, and now I've got to go inside. And then like 15 minutes later, it's revealed that, well, you know, she's always been looking at you. And it's like, what?
It's a metaphor. She's lighting the flames, you know.
Yeah. And I was like, I didn't notice that she was doing anything but just trying to put him off politely, and also that she couldn't actually get away at the same time, which is a real issue. And then to have a character like Eunice, who is supposed to be hailing from Hispania, is played by an Italian actress. So you've got a whole bunch of layers of like the exotic other, and it's also kind of like a favor because it's being filmed in Italy, and you've got that context playing in the back of your mind. And then she's just completely subservient, and you're like, okay, well, this is a complete metaphor for the way that Cinecittà is being used by Hollywood for its cheap labor.
Yeah, I think it's also in the movie, in the novel that this is based on. The Petronius character, I think, is quite similar in many ways, but you get to see obviously a little bit more detail, a little bit more of his inner thoughts, perhaps, in the novel. And I believe in the novel, he is portrayed as someone who's obviously a real ascete, you know, someone who's really into beauty in the world. And he's not cruel, but that's more because being cruel doesn't lead to, you know, things that are attractive and beautiful. And when he's about to commit suicide in the novel, he thinks sort of regretfully of a particular vase that he's very fond of, and Eunice. And so it's kind of buying into that whole Petronius characterization, which, yeah, in the movie, I think it seems like he really genuinely cares about her by the end. At first, she is just an object, but by the end, he cares about her. Whereas I don't know that that's as clear in the novel.
I thought it was also interesting with Robert Taylor as Marcus Vinicius. In the beginning of the film, he's acting like a classic Roman soldier. He wants to take Lygia, and then when he becomes Christian, then he turns into basically like the archetypal G.I. Joe, who's always doing right. And when he fights through the sewers to get the people out of the flame, and then basically everything else is like the perfect archetype of an American soldier, what they would want from one in World War II.
Definitely. Yeah. And I don't think that's an accident, because he is going to be the person. The weird thing about the way that the Roman Christian dynamic plays out all throughout, really, from the Victorian era into Hollywood in the 1950s, is that for both America and Britain, who see themselves as being, you know, connected to Rome and the heirs of a lot of the good aspects of Rome, you know, and obviously there's a lot of political connections and that sort of thing. At the same time, they also don't want to see themselves as Rome. Rome falls. Rome becomes corrupted. They want to see themselves as the Christians. So Rome is always something that is, as one of my favorite books says, it's both the other and something that they can identify with. It's painfully familiar. So I think it's kind of good to have these sorts of stories in their minds, because you do get to see someone from the Roman side who you can kind of identify with, who also comes over to the Christian side, so that you sort of get that nice blend where you can identify with both aspects, and it makes it perhaps slightly less uncomfortable to know exactly who it is you're supposed to be identifying and seeing yourself in during the film.